إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستهديه ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن سيدنا محمدًا عبده ورسوله ونبيه وصفيه وحبيبه بلغ الرسالة وأدى الأمانة ونصح للأمة وجاهد في سبيل الله حتى أتاه اليقين وتركنا على المحجة البيضاء ليلها كنهارها لا يزيغ عنها إلا هالك فاللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد في الأولين وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد في الآخرين وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد في الملأ الأعلى إلى يوم الدين وصل وسلم على سيدنا محمد في كل وقت وحين وعلى آله الأطهار وعلى أصحابه الأخيار وعلى أتباعه الأبرار إلى يوم الدين يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما وبعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وإن خير الهدي هدي سيدنا ومولانا رسول الله وإن شر الأمور لمحدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. I wanted to reflect a little bit this afternoon on how we deal with calamity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, وَلَنُذِيقَنَّهُم مِّنَ الْعَذَابِ الْأَدْنَى دُونَ الْعَذَابِ الْأَكْبَرِ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْجِعُونَ. Allah ta'ala tells us that He causes us to taste the smaller calamity, the lesser calamity, before the greater calamity, in order that we come back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, in its most basic understanding, the greater calamity is, Allah Ta'ala protect us, the calamity of the hereafter. When there's no, لَا يَفِرُّ الْمَرْءُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ, when everyone will flee from everyone. So therefore, anything that we experience in this life is the smaller calamity, is the smaller catastrophe, is the smaller tribulation, when you compare it to that. Now, when you experience it, obviously we don't feel like that. We feel like it's the end of the world and it's the end of our life, and sometimes we're overwhelmed by the calamity. Sometimes the calamity and the tribulation crush us, can remove our humanity, allows us to become despondent, to become depressed, to give up. Some people, wa'ayadu billah, will take their own lives due to the darkness that they find themselves in. However, Allah Ta'ala tells us all of the things that we experience in this life are a small version of what we will experience, or some will experience in the hereafter. But there is a wisdom behind us experiencing that, so we come back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Come back to our humanity. I wanted to reflect on this today by providing, I think, 3 approaches to how we can deal with calamities in ascending order. So number 3 on the list is the importance of remembering what our perspective is, or what our perspective should be. As believers, our perspective should not be limited to this life alone, should not be limited to this time alone, should not be limited to this geography alone, to this circumstance alone. But rather, as believers, we are to have a broader perspective, a higher perspective, a larger perspective, a historical perspective. And by history, I don't mean, in 1855, this, I don't mean that. I mean historical perspective going back to the creation of time. and knowing how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has caused people to rise and to fall, has given people power and removed that power, has alternated these centers of power. وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. This is one of the sunnahs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, one of the things about the Quran is that the Quran reminds us of ancient history. Talks about Bani Israel 4, 5, 6,000 years ago. Talks about Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam even way before that. Talks about Ad and Thamud, the ancient Arab Anbiya. We call them the proto-Arabs. They were before the Arabs that no longer exist. I mean, we're talking about ancient stuff. The Quran reminds us of these stories. We read them every day as if they're happening here and now. So part of our perspective is to remember how time works, and that time itself is just one of the dimensions that encapsulates the human condition, and that time is ultimately relative, because Allah Ta'ala tells us, إِنَّهُمْ يَرَوْنَهُ بَعِيدًا وَنَرَاهُ قَرِيبًا. People that don't believe, they see the stuff that Allah is talking about, this cataclysmic end of time stuff. Oh, that's so far away. Yeah, that's so far away. But we, because we believe, we see that it is near. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said to his companions, "Bu'ithtu ana wa sa'atika hatayn." I am the final hour, we're sent like this, and he put his two fingers together. Even though we haven't witnessed the end of time, but the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam preached and taught and lived as if that was the end of time, was right around the corner. When he told the companions about the Dajjal, he said, if the Dajjal comes and I'm alive, I'll take care of him for you guys. So there was even a possibility, he was living with a possibility that might happen now, because he had a broad perspective. There's an interesting hadith in which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, لا تسبوا الدهر. Do not curse time, فإن الله الدهر. Because God is time. Meaning that Allah Ta'ala is the creator of time. He's the creator of space. And therefore, we are meant to be patient. Right? That's the one thing that we don't like. We don't want to be patient. We want it right now. We want the good stuff right now. We want the bad stuff to go away right now. And we lose our patience. But because of our perspective, we should remember that Allah Ta'ala is the creator of this time. And part of that perspective is that nothing happens in this universe except that Allah Ta'ala allows it to happen, wills it to happen. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. The good stuff and the bad stuff. Just because something bad happened, it doesn't mean that Allah is pleased with it. That's how the Sunni theologians deal with this issue. It doesn't mean that Allah is pleased with injustice, that Allah is pleased with the genocide of a people, that Allah is pleased with the loss of innocent life. But certainly none of that would happen had Allah not allowed it to happen. So there is nothing in the created world that happens except that Allah wills it to happen. So when we see the calamity, God forbid if it's us that experience the calamity, or it's our neighbors, or our community, or our nation, or somebody else out there, we must remember our perspective. That nothing happens except that Allah Ta'ala allows it to happen. That Allah is the creator of the heavens and the earth. And that indeed with the passage of time, we will see the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unfurl themselves. So number 3 in my short list of 3 is perspective, to remember our perspective. The second one, I would say, is the importance of living with purpose, living a moral life, being the leader of your own life. When some things happen that upset our balance, that upset our status quo, people that do not have principles upon which they base their life, they are the ones that are usually lost. And that's why Allah Ta'ala calls those times of fitna, tribulation. The tribulation of war, the fog of war as we say in English, in Arabic or the Quranic language we call it fitna, or the fitna of any calamity, especially when you cannot tell what the truth is. The Prophet ﷺ, he talked about a blind tribulation, fitnatu amya. He talked about a thick tribulation, fitnatu dahma. He talked about a tribulation that will cause people to cry, fitnatun bakma. sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he talked about the end of time stuff, he said we will experience the humankind will experience these different types of tribulations. In addressing that, the companions, they said, well, what do we do? What do we do in that time when there's all this crazy stuff? He said it will be so bad that the person killing, there'll be a lot of killing. And the person that kills will not know why they killed. The person that was killed, they won't know why they were killed. A person will wake up in the morning a believer and go to sleep a disbeliever. A person will wake up a disbeliever and go to sleep a believer. That's crazy stuff. It's off kilter completely. The Prophet ﷺ told us to hold to the community, to hold to our principles, to hold to the leaders of our community, to hold to our families. Even if it's so bad, you're at home with your family and death will find you there. Meaning that there might be a fitna, there might be a time in a tribulation where it's best not to talk, where it's best not to engage, where it's best not to step out, metaphorically, of course. It doesn't mean like you don't leave your home, but metaphorically, it's not the time to interact with this fitna, to keep your head down, to not lose yourself. Some people, that's not their calling. Some people, they are meant to fight in the middle of the thick of it all. And may Allah Ta'ala make those amongst us who are, that's their role, make them steadfast. But not everyone can do that because it can be crushing. So the number 2 on this list is to remember our principles. To not lose ourselves when everyone out there loses their principles. I still think of that, what was that guy's name? Stewart, what was his last name? Anyway, the guy in New York, right? I'm never going to forget this guy. Because I told you last week how he elicited for me this childhood memory. I was trying to think this last week if I had told my parents about what happened to me in the 4th grade. I don't think I even told my parents. That's how much I repressed it. But I tipped my turban to Stewart because he caused me to remember that incident. Now, what's amazing about that, other than it was filmed, I mean, some of you are shocked. I mean, I wasn't shocked when I saw that because I've been dealing with people like that my whole life. But what was so interesting that it was filmed is that the vendor, right, that poor young Egyptian guy in the halal cart, he didn't lose his temper. He didn't step out and start beating the guy. He didn't yell at him. He didn't curse him. Obviously, this guy was Jewish or Zionist or, one of those. He didn't go and, attack what he believes in, right? Because that's what Allah Ta'ala tells us. Don't curse the things that other people worship. Because then they will come and they will curse Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're not the people that burn flags, that burn people in effigy. We're not the people that criticize, we can critique other thoughts and things like that, but we do not defile those items or those names or those concepts which the Quran calls alih, false gods, that other people worship, because we don't want them to take that and come and curse Allah or the Prophet. Because if somebody is in front of you and he curses the Prophet ﷺ, I wouldn't blame you if you couldn't control yourself. But that kid, that young man who was later interviewed, he didn't lose his principles. He didn't lose his cool at that time of tribulation. And that's why he came out on top. Now imagine this example on a larger scale. Huge, civil strife in a nation. May Allah Ta'ala protect us. Or the things that we see, and I'm not speaking today in reference to anything specific, I'm just speaking in general. Imagine living through a country that's experiencing civil war. I just came back from Rwanda yesterday, and every time I'm in Rwanda, they remind us of the genocide that happened between the Rwandan people themselves. It's a part of now the national conversation. You can't escape it. Imagine, I was just trying to think, imagine living through something like that, where people are killing each other because they're from the wrong tribe. Again, you have to remember your principles. You have to live your life with purpose and dedicate yourself to these principles no matter what. The respect of others, calling for peace, calling for sanity, so on and so forth. Number 1 on the list. So we talked about, what did we talk about? I forgot. We talked about perspective, and then we talked about moral leadership or living with principles. And the first, and what I think is the most important, is what Allah says in the verse, لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْجِعُونَ, is for us to go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by making tawbah, by repenting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. Allah ta'ala says in the Quran, those who experience a calamity, their instinct is to say, to Allah we belong and to Him we return. It's at the time of fitna, it's at the time of the calamity, it's at the time of tribulation that you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're not going to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the time of the tribulation, at the time of the calamity, if you're not always remembering Allah. So it's a whole package. You can't say, yeah, when something bad happens, I'm going to remember Allah, and then forget about Allah. It's not going to work. You have to remember Allah ta'ala dhikran kathira. You have to remember Allah ta'ala often, day and night, bukratan wa asila. That which you remember all the time is a reflection of what's in your heart. People that follow fads or trends or influencers, if you spend time with them, you'll see they're always talking about those things that they're obsessed with. Because that's what's inside them, that's what's consuming them at that moment. So we need to be consumed with the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we need to remember the importance of turning back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I want to end with a story that I think will summarize these three things. A story that I heard from my teachers, who heard from their teachers, that in the 19 teens, let's say 14, 15, a great Iraqi Naqshbandi scholar came from Iraq, from Sulaimaniyya to Egypt. His name was Muhammad Amin al-Baghdadi, radiyallahu anhu. And Muhammad Amin al-Baghdadi, after his sheikh passed away in Sulaimaniyya, he tried to find a new home. He went to the Istanbul and he wanted to spend time there. Anyway, make a long story short, he ended up in Cairo. And there's a mosque behind the Sayyidina al-Hussein mosque in Old Cairo called Zahir Jashankir. It's named after one of the Circassian Mamluk leaders. And he took residence in that mosque. And that mosque is peculiar because when you walk into the mosque, it's a very beautiful courtyard. But there are all of these little rooms on the side of the mosque, these little khalwas, where students would stay and they would live there, they would worship, they would study. And he took residence in one of these khalwas, one of these isolated rooms. This man was a very pious man. He was somebody who the people that knew him knew that he was a radium, and he would walk and you could see that type of light, you could feel that type of energy from him. One day he was walking, maybe he was coming back from prayer or something with his students, and he was accosted in the street by a drunk man, a Muslim, who was drunk. He smelled like alcohol, and he was rude with the sheikh, and he told the sheikh, give me money. Right? So the sheikh put his hand in his pocket and he gave him money. Now the students obviously were upset. After the man left, what are you doing, Maulana? And this guy is drunk. Obviously he's just going to take this money and buy more alcohol. You're helping him perform the haram. When you're students, you always try to take what the sheikh teaches you literally, and you try to stump the sheikh. So the sheikh was very upset. He didn't even say, he just gave him an expression like, you don't know what you're talking about, right? Because he had perspective. So he returns to the mosque. Sheikh Muhammad Amin Baghdadi, he returns to the mosque. And a couple of weeks pass, and then this drunk guy, found the sheikh. He went to the mosque and he wants to meet with the sheikh. Of course, the students, being students, they wanted to prevent him, from reaching the sheikh because they didn't want him to be accosted and to be rude. And he said, no, I need to speak with him. Tell him I'm the guy that met him in the street, a couple of weeks ago, etc. So he went to the sheikh and he said, Maulana, what did you put in the money that you gave me? And he said, what are you talking about? I didn't put anything in the money. What are you talking about? He said, no. He said, every day I wake up in the morning, I go to the local bar or alcohol shop, and I drink. After I met you, I went and I started drinking, and then I started throwing up. So I said to myself, maybe I'm sick, maybe I got a stomach bug. 1 day, 2 day, 3, by the third, fourth day, I couldn't stand the smell of alcohol. I even smelling it would cause me to throw up. What did you put in this money? Sheikh said, I didn't put anything in this money. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yahdi man yasha. Allah ta'ala guides the people whom He wants. So the man said, I want what's in that money. So the Sheikh said, make your tawbah, turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and stay with us. Pray, make your wudu, learn with us. And he became one of his loyal students. And then a month or two pass, and then the man comes back to the sheikh. He says, Maulana, I have a question for you. I've been with you guys for a couple of months now. how it's part of this thing that you have, this way of worshiping Allah. Is it that you have to be poor in this world? The Shaykh said, no, this has nothing to do with that. Shaykh said, why are you asking? He's like, because when I first met you, when I was drunk, when I first met you, I used to make £6 a month. Of course, 6 Egyptian pounds now doesn't exist. This is way before when they floated the currency. This is when it was actually 6 sterling, pounds, and it was connected to the gold. It was a lot of money. After I met you, I started making 4. So I want to know, is this part of being a good Muslim that you have to live poorly? The Sheikh said, slow down. How much did you used to give to your local bar every month? So the man, he calculated, he said £2. He said, Allah Ta'ala gave you your sustenance before, £6. 2 of those were for the bartender. And He put in that it was haram. And now Allah Ta'ala has given you £4, and all of it is halal. So those £2 to start out weren't yours. They were the rizq of the bartender. The man accepted. He was one of his loyal students, and this man died during the time of the Shaykh, while the Shaykh was alive. The Shaykh died, Muhammad Amin Baghdadi died in 1940. So this man died sometime in the 20s or the 30s, and the Shaykh himself washed his body, shrouded his body, and all of the people that were in the room that were with the Shaykh when they were getting the man's body ready for burial, they all said that this man's body was illuminated when he was on his deathbed, or when he had passed. They bore witness to this. This story is interesting because for me it summarizes these 3 things. It teaches us the importance of tawbah, the power of tawbah, the power of genuinely returning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of our shortcomings. It also shows us the importance of our principles. The Shaykh didn't turn the man away because he was in sin. The Shaykh didn't turn the man away because he was rude, or he wasn't, he didn't look the right way. The Shaykh accepted him for who he was and gave him and helped him how he could. And the third thing is it teaches us the importance of perspective. Now the Shaykh didn't judge the man when he came. The students judged the man. The students were upset, but the Shaykh didn't judge the man. We don't know, maybe I don't know the details of the story. It's an old story. Maybe the Shaykh made dua for him. Maybe the Shaykh said a prayer before he gave him the money. Maybe he put something, who knows the details. But the important thing is the Shaykh's perspective was broader, was longer, was wider than what the students around him had seen. And because of the Shaykh's perspective, and because of his principles, and because of his guidance of this man turned his life around. He became a practicing Muslim, and he died, in the best of ways possible. This is just a small story that we inherit from our teachers. Imagine how these 3 things can change your life. How you can survive the calamities that you face in your life. How you can survive the calamities that we all face together. Now we are, as a global community, experiencing many difficult things. Now one of the reasons why we get frustrated when we experience these difficult things is that we forget that we are only going to be as strong as our weakest link. So in a way, the problems that we experience globally come back to each one of us individually. How we are with our Islam, how we are with our perspective, how we are with our principles. So if we get frustrated from time to time, let us remember the lesson that Allah Ta'ala causes us to taste the smaller calamity before the larger one, in order that we come back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله ولي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. A few announcements before the dua. Tonight, inshallah, we resume our Friday night class at 7:30. It will be at the mosque, inshallah, and online. We'll continue our reading of the Shifa of Qadi Ayad, rahimahullah. Also, Sunday morning, the halaqah resumes at 6:15 with Imam al-Rafa'i. And a reminder that next Saturday at 5 p.m., we have the program at the masjid with Muhammad Zakaria, the calligrapher whom I spoke about last week. It's a tremendous opportunity for you to come, and your families. Is a lovely person and extremely talented, and it's something really unique to experience. So I hope that you guys can come, inshallah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us overcome the calamities that we face individually and collectively. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to put ease and calm in our heart, to make us people of the Quran and Sunnah. We ask Allah ta'ala to lift us and lift those around us, to have protection on our children, to have mercy on our parents. We ask Allah ta'ala's forgiveness for those whom we have lost before us. We ask Allah ta'ala to protect our masjid, our businesses, our schools, our community. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase the love and the harmony within this community and indeed all of our communities in this area. فَاللَّهُمَّ اهْدِنَا فِي مَنْ هَدَيْتَ وَعَافِنَا فِي مَنْ عَافَيْتَ وَتَوَلَّنَا فِي مَنْ تَوَلَّيْتَ وَبَارِكْ لَنَا فِي مَا أَعْطَيْتَ وَقِنَا وَاصْرِفْ عَنَّا شَرَّ مَا قَضَيْتَ اللهم تقبل صلاتنا وصيامنا وقيامنا وركوعنا وسجودنا يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وإسرافنا في أمرنا وثبت أقدامنا وانصرنا على القوم الكافرين وأنقلنا من دائرة سخطك إلى دائرة رضاك وافتح علينا فتوح العارفين بك واحشرنا تحت لواء نبيك صلى الله عليه وسلم يوم القيامة. اللهم اسقنا من يده الشريفة شربة ماء لا نظمأ بعدها أبدا ثم أدخلنا الجنة بغير حساب ولا سابقة عقاب ولا عتاب ومتعنا بالنظر إلى وجهك الكريم في جنات الخلد يا رحيم. فاللهم ارحم حينا وميتنا وحاضرنا وغائبنا وارفع أيدي الأمم عنا وأقمنا بالحق وأقم الحق بنا. آمين 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 والحمد لله رب العالمين. وصل اللهم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم وأقم الصلاة إن الصلاة كانت على المؤمنين كتابا موقوتا.